In this, our first week of the semester, we are going to get through some very basic information here that will be pivotal to understanding what we're actually going to be doing in this course. Because in a history course, you'd assume that what you're going to be doing is studying historical events, historical actors, persons, institutions, so on and so forth. But with a historiography class like this, we are doing something a little different. Rather, what we are doing is we are looking at how historians have understood historical events. And this requires us to sort of move beyond the notion that historians are simply collectors of information, that we are like sponges and we soak in a bunch of information, and that we are good in things like trivia. History is definitely part memorization, part acknowledgement that all of these things happen, understanding that these things happen, but it's far more significant than that, what the historian must do. And that is what we are going to focus on in this class. And again, looking at the ways that this is sort of born out of what historiography is early on here. With that in mind, we're going to start with the question, what is history? History is often understood as a study of what happened in the past. There is a tendency, therefore, at least in the public, to view it as a collection of facts. These so-called, quote, facts, collected from the contemporaneous documents produced during the period under investigation, primary source documents, point to a certain, quote, objectivity of historical research. So that is one of the themes that we're going to be picking up a lot on in this class, in fact, is this idea of objectivity in history. And to a certain degree, once again, there is some truth in that notion. History, at least as an academic discipline, is objective. It is relying on materials that were, again, created by persons who actually experienced these events. So in that way, it is very much like the STEM classes that you may have taken in the past, whether that's science, whether that's technology, whether that's physics, mathematics, whatever. There is a certain degree of objectivity. But at the same time, there are at least 15,000 books that have been written about Abraham Lincoln. Why? If history is just a collection of facts, why are there more than a few books about Lincoln necessary? Again, if you were just as a collector of facts, a historian, writing about Lincoln, there's only so much you can say about this man. So with this in mind, we are now moving into the significant portion of this lecture for this week, because we are moving past that notion that history is just about the collection of facts, and we are finally now reaching a point where it's necessary to say and understand that history is also the representation of that past in the work of historians. So therefore, to go back to my earlier comparison between a historian, a scientist, and a mathematician, unlike the latter two, the scientist or mathematician, who can use the same inputs and through calculation or experimentation produce the same results or conclusion, historians often use the same primary source documents but reach dramatically different conclusions. In other words, while the past does not change, how historians interpret and portray the past does evolve over time. Our understanding of history changes over time due to the emergence of new evidence, so there is that. But just as often, in fact probably more often, you will see historical understanding of events change, not necessarily because there's new evidence available, but rather because historians have begun to pose new questions about this evidence. And a lot of times these new questions will arise because of changing cultural and societal norms. You see this, for instance, perhaps in the way that slavery is understood. Obviously, something that was written in the 1890s is going to look different than something that was written in 2024. And the reason why is because American society itself has changed during this 100 and some odd years. Whereas in the 1890s, the United States was still sort of accepting this racist understanding of African Americans with the growth of Jim Crow after the release of the slaves and their freedom. By 2024, that is less acceptable. So therefore, historians who are around in 2024 will look at the Civil War differently than those historians from the 1890s. Our understanding of history changes over time because of this. Therefore, history is best understood as a continual, open-ended process of argument. It is a conversation among and between historians. This conversation takes place over many centuries, as any historical moment can be looked at anew as a result of, again, this newly available evidence or by taking a new look at old evidence. In other words, there are no final answers in history, which again explains why there can be 15,000 books about Abraham Lincoln. Rather, what we see, history is again a conversation that takes place over time. So as a result of that, I want you to be very clear in your understanding right from the get-go in this course that what we are talking about here is the history of history. When reading works of history, historians are more concerned with understanding the arguments presented in the articles or books that were written about a particular historical subject or era, not necessarily the events that were being described in these books. Therefore, we are more concerned as historians with interpretation and argument rather than just regurgitation of facts. And as a result of this, and this is what this course is going to get into, we see over time sort of historians beginning to fall under certain schools, if you will, quote, schools of thought that change over time. So for instance, in the early 20th century, they had a school known as the New History, which we'll talk about. In the 1960s, they had a school known as the Revisionist School. We'll talk about that as well. So we are looking again at these historians over time as opposed to the events that these historians were writing about. That is what is of importance in a class like this about historiography. Historiography, therefore, is the history of history. We will not concern ourselves in this class with talking about Barack Obama's presidency or some other historical person or event. Rather, we'll study how earlier historians have looked at the event, looking at how historians in different eras have understood this same event. In fact, if you look at the beginning of an academic article or the introduction of a book, you'll often see the author refer to how earlier historians have viewed the topic under investigation in the article or book. Again, putting in a place of importance here, right at the beginning of their article or book, the idea that this is what other of my colleagues and associates in history departments have said. And this is what I'm going to add to the conversation. And we can see where this conversation takes place in one example here, a guy by the name of Thomas J. Segru, who wrote in 1996 a very prominent book up until this present day known as The Origins of the Urban Crisis, Race and Inequality in Post-War Detroit. Here is what he says in his introduction to that book. Quote, "The underclass debate has moved in three, sometimes overlapping directions. The first, and most influential, focuses on the behavior and values of the poor and the role of federal social programs in fostering a culture of joblessness and dependency in inner cities. The second offers structural explanations for inequality and urban poverty. A third explanation focuses on politics, emphasizing the marginalization of cities in American social policy, particularly in the aftermath of the urban unrest and racial conflict of the 1960s. What is largely missing from the underclass debate is the perspective of history. My examination of Detroit is the quarter century after World War II suggests." So what we are seeing here in this example is generally he is pointing to three schools of thought, if you will, that have discussed the place of African Americans and the role of federal policies in attempting to aid those African Americans who are struggling to survive economically in urban areas. Now, at the same time, as we look at this example, if we look at the last line, the last sentence, what happens is we see the thesis where this historian, Thomas Segru, enters the conversation, what argument he is making. And as a result of this, I want to highlight here, the thesis becomes the analytical heart and soul of any work of historiography. That is what you read for. That is what you are looking for. Even you, later in the semester, when you are going to be reading the book that is assigned for this semester for our book review, you are going to be looking at the introduction. You are trying to find the thesis that this author makes. Thesis statements, which again will appear in the introduction, can be just one sentence or they can take up as many as a few pages. But nonetheless, they highlight the author's argument, of course, and they show where he or she fits within the historical debate and conversation that is taking place during this time regarding that particular event. Up until this point, I've been talking more about the sort of details of historiography, what historiography actually involves. Well, now I actually want to give you a concrete example of this historiography, and to do so, we're going to look at that individual on the right, Christopher Columbus, and historians' love-hate relationship with him across time. In fact, let us look here at how historians have portrayed Christopher Columbus through the years. Historians' interpretation of Columbus has changed as a result of several things. First of all, different political agendas from early times to later times, more recent times. We also see different cultural assumptions. This is sort of what I was referring to back with the issue of slavery, how historians view slavery in the late 19th century versus the 20th century. We also see different historical methodology that arises in the 20th century that leads to different forms of historical research. And similarly and related to this is a focus on different aspects of Columbus and his journey. So in the case of Columbus, no new evidence became available between 1892 and 1992. But nonetheless, despite this, the image of Columbus underwent a dramatic transformation during this 100 years. For example, during the 400-year anniversary celebrations that were held in 1892, Columbus was praised and portrayed as an exemplar of European civilization. Crowds on both sides of the Atlantic commended Columbus for spreading Christianity to heathens. Columbus came to really epitomize, during this time in the late 19th century, the notion of progress. Well, let's compare this very positive portrayal of Columbus in 1892 with the 500th anniversary of Columbus's voyage in 1992. By this point, many nations had freed themselves from centuries of colonization. As a result, this perspective led to Columbus being viewed less as a signifier of progress and more as a colonizer who deserved scorn as opposed to celebration. Less Eurocentric, this new understanding of Columbus was brought about really by a greater interest in the stories about those individuals impacted by European colonialism, particularly the natives of these and other regions. In short, changes in the 20th century created a different framework for interpreting the past. Now, I do want to mention this. As we see more and more blowback against this notion of Christopher Columbus as the ultimate explorer and purveyor of Western ideas, we saw a lot of critics during this time also question this new approach. Some of these critics describe such changes in interpretation as nothing more than relativism, meaning the idea that our ideas can change over time without really much consideration of the facts that exist, and therefore threatening to reduce history to fiction. However, at the end of the day, true historical research, including that on Christopher Columbus, relies on a real past that left behind fragments used by historians. We can see, as a result, changes in how Columbus is portrayed, but it is again always grounded, at least good history, always grounded in actual primary source document research. But nonetheless, again, this would be the understanding, and we see this in the example of the book on the right, Lies My Teacher Told Me About Christopher Columbus, What Your History Books Got Wrong, written during this period in the late 20th century by James Loewen. I wanted to conclude this lecture by talking about what these differences in interpretation actually look like in actual historical research. So we can see these differences in the historical understanding of Columbus in two works published just 20 years apart. So the first one, published in 1992, said the following: "The Spain that Christopher Columbus and his crews left behind just before dawn on August 3, 1492, as they sailed forth from Palos and out into the Atlantic, was for most of its people a land of violence, squalor, treachery, and intolerance. In this respect, Spain was no different from the rest of Europe." So as we're seeing here in this short quote, rather than a Europe that is all about advanced civilizations and progress, we see this historian, David Stannard, talking about how this Europe is actually debauchery, nothing more. It is just a land of violence, squalor, treachery, and intolerance, as he says in that quote. And as you can see, even the title that this book comes from, American Holocaust, Columbus and the Conquest of the New World, the language that he uses in the title, he describes Columbus coming to the New World as a Holocaust because of the deaths, of course, of the natives. Well, let's compare this to a book that was written just 20 years earlier in 1972, and we'll see a huge difference in interpretation of Columbus. This author, Thomas Gritter, said the following: "Columbus personified the modern spirit. A modest capitalist, he invested some of his own money in the venture. When his tiny vessels dipped below the horizon in 1492, they carried with them a transcendent faith in the individual and a passion for wealth, power, and glory." Again, let's start here by looking at the title of this book, A Brief History of Western Man. Western man, worthy of a book here. And as you can see, this Western man, Columbus, is portrayed as representing the, quote, modern spirit. He was a capitalist, willing to put some of his own money forward to sail the seas into the New World. This kind of heroism, his tiny vessels dip below the horizon, a transcendent faith in the individual, and a passion for wealth, power, and glory. This is viewed in a positive light here. And clearly, we can see, again, just in this short period of 20 years, the dramatic difference in how Columbus is portrayed. And these differences have important ramifications. We're talking about historiography, we're talking about history here, but think about how these things, and we're going to see this in some of our own coursework later in the semester by talking about the Enola Gay sort of drama that took place in the late 20th century, some of the debates that are going on in the 21st century. With Columbus as well. In 2024, there is now a lot of criticism of having a Columbus Day in October, of course, a celebration of this man who did so much in terms of treatment of natives, so many terrible things. So again, yes, we're focusing on history, but it has ramifications beyond the page and beyond the classroom lecture hall.